So my presentation, like Derek said, is about the Krag Jorgensen rifle, but it's not specifically just the Krag Jorgensen. It's about the lives of the inventors. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the development of the Krag Jorgensen rifle, but really what I want to focus on is the early firearms designs they worked on, the firearms they worked on together, and then after the adoption of the Krag Jorgensen rifle in Denmark and Norway and the US, what they did up until their deaths. So, for anyone who doesn't know, the Krag Jorgensen rifle is the smokeless powder, or the first smokeless powder repeating arm adopted by Denmark and Norway and the US, invented by these two guys, Ole Krag and Erik Jorgensen, who are two Norwegian arms designers. People are probably more familiar with the history of the American firearm because that was definitely the most popular, even though it was only used for around 8 or 9 years, as opposed to the 40 to 50 odd years the Danish and American ones were used. And the origins of the guns aren't very well known. So I'm going to cover that a little bit in this presentation while I talk about the lives of these guys. So part one of my presentation is going to be focusing on Ole Herman Johannes Krag. It's going to be focusing on his early gun designs up until the moment he meets Erik Jorgensen. And then we'll talk about Erik Jorgensen's early life up until he meets Krag. And then we'll cover the collaboration they had together and then the designs following that. So, Ole Krag was born on the 7th of April, 1836, and he was one of 9 children of Hans Peter Schindler Krag and Hermanna Krag. Krag's father was a prominent priest in the Lutheran Church in Norway, and he actually helped fund several different institutions in Norway. He was an educator. He founded a lot of schools, especially up north in Norway, and he was also a military historian and wrote several books. He had a pretty good reputation around Norway. He was a confidant of the King of Sweden, and he was known as the Vaga priest because he was mainly operating in Vaga. But he was assigned to different parishes around Norway, and because of that, Krag bounced around to different cities when he was growing up. He mainly grew up in Eidsvoll and Fredrikstad, and because of his family's reputation, he grew up very rich. It was well, I don't want to say very rich, but he was definitely upper middle class during his childhood. Around the age of 14, Krag studied drafting at the Royal Institute of Art and Design in Christiania. And then in 1854, at age 17, he joined the war school in Christiania. And after graduating in 1857, he was granted the rank of second lieutenant in the 1st Akerhus Brigade. His early career actually ended up becoming industrial engineering rather than gunsmithing. He worked in roles like railway design and road administration, and he worked alongside his 3 older brothers, Thomas Peter Krag, Peter Rasmus Krag, and Hans Hagerup Krag. Hans Hagerup Krag was actually known as the road director. He was responsible for a lot of the work that happened in Norway for road administration and railway design at the time. And a lot of people today still credit him as being responsible for the majority of Norway's modern infrastructure. So Krag worked under him. He worked on developments like the Drammen-Rensford Railway. A lot of the urban planning in southern Kongsberg was done by him as well, and a lot more. So Krag, he excelled in roadway administration. He became known for tinkering and repairing tools and coming up with new machinery for construction. And through this, he ended up dabbling in a lot of chemistry to aid in construction projects. So he specifically started developing explosive powders for mining and rock blasting. In 1861, he actually patented an early blasting jelly in France and is credited as the first person actually to use nitroglycerin for the purposes of rock blasting. I'm assuming the reason for this is because Norway and Sweden were a union at the time, which means he would have been probably working alongside Alfred Nobel at some point, so he would have had really early access to nitroglycerin. And when he worked in road administration, he was eventually promoted to the first lieutenant on the 31st of June, 1861. Now, during his time in roadway administration, he sought a transfer to the artillery because he started to grow an interest in firearms development. So once he passed his war exams in 1863, he put in an application to transfer to the artillery technical department, and on the 17th of March, 1864, he was successful. And a year later, on the 15th of May, 1865, he was promoted to sergeant. And once he started working for the artillery technical department, he became known for his work through small-scale gunsmithing and toolmaking at various small arsenals around Norway. The earliest work that he was involved in was usually converting muzzleloading rifles to use the Lund breech-loading conversions, and there were some that were already breech loaders that he was converting to self-contained metallic cartridge firing guns, as pictured here. He also wanted to get a job as some sort of gunsmith or weapons inspector at Kongsberg Waffenfabrik. So his armorer's exam actually involved him putting together one of these guns, as you can see here. And he had to inspect it and proof it and show that he was able to do every step of the manufacturing and inspection of the gun. And that eventually landed him a job on the 15th of September, 1866, at the factory where he worked as a weapons inspector trainee. And only 2 years later, by the 15th of April, 1868, he ended up being promoted to the main control officer of their conversion gun workshop. So he was definitely good at his job, enough to get promoted pretty early on in his career. So when he worked at Kongsberg, he spent a lot of time updating their tooling and manufacturing processes. Apparently, they were very outdated with their manufacturing. So he spent a lot of his time doing that. And actually, throughout his entire career at Kongsberg, he spent a lot of time trying to update their tooling and modernize them. Um, while he worked there, he also began developing his own equipment for the artillery and some of his own firearms. For example, Krag developed the cartridge and equipment pouches for the artillery that were used with the rolling block, and he also designed the rear sight and the bayonet for the Norwegian 1867 rolling block rifle. Now, for every one of Krag's developments that he ended up getting adopted, there was dozens of others that were definitely way too unfinished and were not adopted. But none of the dismissals of his designs ever dissuaded him from continuing with his experiments. So in 1868, he actually patented his own firearms designs and he wanted to produce them, but he was not permitted by the factory director, Jens Landsmark, at Kongsberg to use the tooling there to make them. This was seen by Krag as unfair, as he writes in 1898 in one of his memoirs, because the gunsmiths at the time in Norway, who were independent gunsmiths, were actually permitted by the arsenal to send them design drawings and money in exchange for them manufacturing guns on their behalf. And Krag was barred from doing this. He thought it was probably because they saw him as a worker at the arsenal to be some sort of conflict of interest. So he was forced to start his own workshop on his farm called Sedlegard in Kongsberg. And at this farm, he employed several independent gunsmiths through his own money to work at the shop and produce guns for him, as well as building small parts for other guns that were at the arsenal. And at this workshop is where he started first experimenting with manufacturing. And we can see two of the first kind of Krag rifles that he had designed. He started patenting these guns in 1868 and 1870, but this specific one's from the British patent that was patented 17th of September, 1869. Both of these guns are like, I refer to them as crank arms. They're falling block rifles that are controlled by a crank that turns 180 degrees on the right-hand side of the gun. In Norway, these are referred to as Gevær, which translates to like striker rifle or firing pin rifle. And these guns are very interesting because they appear all throughout Scandinavia. You'll see gunsmiths in Sweden making these, and in Denmark, in Norway. There's some in Finland that make these as well. It seems that like, while the rest of the world was making bolt-action rifles or lever-action rifles, they were making these crank arm guns. Unfortunately, Krag doesn't really differentiate a lot between these two models. So for the purpose of this presentation, I've called them the Model A and Model B. The one on the left is the Model A, and it has a side lock with a manually cocked hammer, and the action is operated by a crank to lower the wedge towards a magazine and to feed it into the action. The Model B is much more refined. It has a centrally located hammer, and the crank actually knocks the bolt out the back of the wedge, which cocks the hammer. It sort of operates like how a Winchester Model 1866 or 1873 has the bolt cock the hammer. Same kind of concept. Now here is just an example of the Model A design. This is serial number 4 of Krag's early prototype designs. This gun has a 10-round magazine, and magazines you'll see throughout this presentation are something that was incredibly important to Krag. It seems that it was more important than the actual firearm design itself. He was a really early proponent of magazines and adopting magazines, and virtually all of his designs, whether they are arms designs or something else entirely, is all based around the concept of a magazine. Here's just an example of the Model B design. Something that I've noticed through extant examples of these guns is that the Model A's tend to be more like military oriented. They seem to be longer, they have bayonet lugs, and the Model B's seem to be more sporting rifles. I'm not sure if that's just a coincidence because of the ones that exist nowadays, but that's just something that I've felt I should mention. On the 24th of September, 1869, the Norwegian military formed a commission to examine domestically produced magazine repeating arms and compare them against the rolling block rifle that was recently adopted. And this is something that actually Krag was pushing for himself because of his love for magazines. And he actually submitted 3 different rifle designs to trials late 1869. It included a wooden mock-up of another rifle, but he didn't actually submit any functioning rifles. So the commission looked at the designs and they said the ones with the crankshaft lever arm, which are the Model A and B that I've shown you, those were the ones that were preferred for further examination and that he should work on those. So on the 22nd of March, 1870, they suggested that Krag's rifle was worthy of consideration and hosted live fire trials of magazine arms in Tonsberg. And these trials saw production of 5 rifles of Krag's at his private workshop, and he was assisted by some small machine shops in Christiania, and larger parts like barrels were made at Kongsberg, and there were some parts from Sweden as well that were added to his rifles. And these rifles were compared against the rolling block and 10 rifles that were produced by another well-known Norwegian gunsmith named Hans Larsen. So Hans Larsen, he's a pretty important figure in Norwegian arms design, and he had his own influence on the Krag Jørgensen rifle that we'll talk about later. And I've included a version of one of his guns here just to show you. Um, you'll notice that these guns are like pretty similar in design, and that's just because a lot of Norwegian gun designers also collaborated with each other, and because they're all like developing essentially the same sort of action. Even on this gun, you'll see the rear sight is Krag's model of rear sight that he patented. It's worth noting that Krag also in 1870 got married to Kaya Collette, and later that month he was promoted to control officer of all of Kongsberg Waffenfabrik. So in 1871, the trials of his gun had ended, and the results were less than favorable for the Krag. The report stated that the rifles were shot for a total of 6 minutes each, and the Remington actually shot an average that was faster than the magazine-fed guns. They shot an average of 14 rounds a minute, the Larsen shot 13 rounds a minute, and the Krag only shot 10 rounds a minute. And this seems to be because the Larsen's rifle and Krag's rifle were based around the use of the magazine, and doctrine at the time still wanted a gun that was primarily used for single shooting, and then having a magazine that was for emergencies or in reserve. Though they did comment on the capabilities of Krag's magazine, and they said that even though his gun was a lot slower to single load, the magazine was the preferred option. So they told him that they wanted him to continue development of it, but just make it easier to load. So Krag took that feedback into account, and he developed this refined version that you see here. This is the model 1871 Krag rifle. Um, it has a side loading magazine, sort of like the Kingsgate magazine on a Winchester. You'll see that instead of having the side lock or the centrally located hammer, it now has a striker that is cocked back. And the functionality of the gun, I'll show you in this video here, just so you're not staring at photos all the time. Um, in later designs, Krag actually went away from this side gate. There's very, very few that have this side gate on it, and I'm not sure if it has something to do with violating some patent with the King side gate or not, or if he just preferred a different design. But he ended up going back to top loading later on. Oh, went a bit too far. Hold on a sec. There we go. So employing multiple gunsmiths to produce these guns was a bit costly, and he never got any financial return from his experimental guns. So to offset his expenses at his private workshop, he had them manufacture like skates and bells and sleds, and he also made some hunting shotguns from discarded parts from the factory, anything that he could do to just make a little bit of money. But eventually he saw this workshop as not profitable, and he closed the business in 1872. And the gunsmiths that he employed there, he ended up giving jobs at the main arsenal. That same year, Krag worked to further refine his Krag rifle. He believed it was still too complicated to operate, so he sought the help of someone he worked along with in railway administration, who was the Swedish-Norwegian engineer Axel Petersen, and he helped him to develop all the modifications to the design that you would see in the eventual gun that was adopted in 1876. Krag actually wrote that the two had perfected the rifle in 1872, and originally he referred to it as the Krag Magazine Rifle Number 6, but Krag later changed the name to Krag Petersen to recognize Petersen's contributions. And Petersen had actually written to Krag that he had sought no recognition or compensation for his part in the redesign because he considered his part too minor, but Krag insisted that he had shared profits in the design and that the design should be adopted. He should get money for it. I provided some early design drawings here from Krag's design journals that are in the Norwegian Armed Forces Museum. There's a lot of really cool stuff in there, way too much to be able to show here. But these are the earliest designs that I'd seen, and they're both dated February 1872. And here's one of the first model 1872 rifles that Krag had produced. This one was made in 1873. You can see that the design went back to that centrally located hammer that the Model B originally had, but there's no crank on the side of the arm anymore to operate the wedge. That was something that Petersen was essential in redesigning. Now, instead, what you do, I've got in this video here to show you, is that you simply push the hammer even further back, and that lowers the block towards the magazine. So then a round will pop up on top of the magazine, and the way that you load the gun is you simply just grab the cartridge that's on top of the block and you push it into the chamber with your thumb. And the rim touches the ejector, closes the wedge, and the gun fires. Now, it's been very hard to find any footage of one of these guns firing, but thankfully, a couple of years ago, a member of the Bergen Shooting Association restored a Krag Peterson rifle and rechambered it and fired it and put a video on YouTube. So that's what this is here. Um, so you can get the basic functioning of the gun. It's a little bit stiff, but I'm just going to chalk that up to it being a rechambering and rebarreling job, and also that the gun is, the guts of the gun's over 150 years old, so we got to cut it a little bit of slack. But you can see how fast the operation of the gun is for a magazine-fed gun from the early 1870s. So this gun was submitted to the Norwegian Small Arms Commission during the summer and fall of 1872 for testing, and it was reportedly a lot better than the previous rifles that they had tested. The trials report states the gun was able to fire 18 to 19 shots per minute, and they emphasized that the shooters that were firing the rifle had no experience with the gun, yet they were still able to fire that fast. And an experienced shooter was able to fire around 25 rounds a minute. However, the Army stated that the design was still not refined enough for wide-scale adoption, so they decided against it, but they told Krag they'd like to see some further iterations. Luckily for Krag, the Norwegian Navy actually thought it was substantial enough to adopt, and in 1876 they bought 975 rifles. 115 rifles or carbines were also produced for the Danish Navy in 1877, but they didn't get any more after that. They just used them for trials, and then they held on to them and used them up until they were replaced in the early 1890s. Krag also traveled abroad to try to promote this rifle in different countries, and one of the most significant countries was France. Krag had a good relationship with French officers at the time. He spoke French, among other languages. Um, and in 1877, in the spring, he had the Krag Peterson tested by the French Navy. And I've included some diagrams here from the National Archives of Norway that show Krag's drawings for the French version that was chambered for 11 millimeter Gras. It wasn't adopted, but Krag actually claims that his magazine regulator system was adapted for the French Kapachek rifles. And I've included a direct quote from him in the bottom corner here where he mentions this. And he apparently had mentioned this to the trials board, and because of his contributions to the magazine system, he was knighted in France as a form of recognition. So despite the Norwegian army stating Krag's design wasn't suitable for mass issue, he ended up submitting it again during further Norwegian-Swedish trials in 1879. He didn't really do this because he thought the gun would be adopted. He just was arguing to the army that they must adopt a magazine-fed arm, regardless of what the arm was. And he saw a lack of magazine firearms being submitted to trials. There's actually something. There's a quote from a couple of years later that I thought was really interesting that I wanted to include here, and it's Krag talking about the lack of magazine arms that are out there, and he doesn't understand why. And he writes to the Danish-Swedish Commission, and he says, "There's a strong sentiment in Sweden against magazine rifles. They have never fully embraced the idea. Nevertheless, whatever is said cannot dissuade my strong conviction that magazine rifles are indeed the alpha and omega of armaments." And at the time, the Norwegian Commission actually favored the bolt-action Yarman rifle that was designed by a Norwegian-Swedish engineer named Jakob Smith Yarman. But they actually wanted to adopt it as a single-shot rifle, which is pretty interesting to people who know the Yarman rifle because of its tubular magazine. But originally, it was going to be adopted as a single-shot rifle. And Yarman didn't want to design a magazine for this, but Krag actually petitioned the trials board and Jacob Yarman to say that the magazine was necessary, and he offered to design a magazine for it for free and required no compensation. He just needed the Norwegian army to have a magazine. So from 1879 to 1880, Krag was permitted to design 2 magazines for this gun. Yarman designed some as well, but they were kind of strange. One of them was like a gravity-fed magazine. But Krag's submissions are pictured here. On the left, it is essentially an adaptation of the Krag Peterson system to a Yarman Action, which didn't perform that well. And then on the right is what Krag referred to as the capsule magazine. And this is really the birth of what the Krag Jørgensen rifle is. This magazine on a rifle that was referred to as the Model B was designed to wrap around the action of any single-shot rifle. So it didn't have to be specifically the Yarman. The system was designed so that it could wrap around any single-shot rifle at the time in case they preferred a different action at some time. And the design was very much in its infancy. During testing, the magazine actually blew off of the gun at a certain point, and it was dismissed from further testing. But Krag believed the capsule magazine was worth further investment and continued to develop the system. The Yarman rifle was eventually adopted with a tubular magazine, but it was a modified version by Yarman. In addition, Axel Peterson had become quite ill during these trials, and he stopped working on the Krag Peterson. He eventually got progressively worse, and he passed away in 1884. And since Krag had been focusing on the capsule magazine already, he fully abandoned the Krag Peterson by this point in time. On the 9th of July, 1880, Jens Landsmark, the director of Kongsberg's Waffenfabrik, he passed away, and on the 3rd of November, Krag was promoted to captain and succeeded him. In this new position, with the entire factory at his disposal, Krag began focusing his time exclusively on developing his own guns and specifically the capsule magazine. So Krag was also granted the historical factory director's residence located at Nymoenstor 406 in Kongsberg. And unfortunately, the original house is gone. Even in this picture in the bottom left corner, that's not what the original structure would have looked like back then. That's had a lot of revisions to it. And as of 2024, it's now a commercial area. But the fun fact actually is that before this building started going under construction in 2024, there was actually a gunsmithing shop there that had Krag Jørgensen rifles in their inventory. So during the summer of 1884, Ole Krag learned of Denmark's search for a magazine repeating rifle, and he wanted to submit the capsule magazine for testing, though he believed that the design was still in need of heavy revisions. So he actually enlisted an army gunsmith from Norway named Erik Jørgensen, who was also one of his close friends, to help refine it before Danish testing. By August 1884, they had sent an improved blueprint to the Danish Commission, and they built an example of the magazine, but they put it onto a Spitulski rifle action. The Spitulski itself is an extremely rare gun. It had some sort of capsule magazine to begin with, but it was seen as too complicated. And the Danish Commission liked the action, but they wanted a magazine replacement, so they saw Krag's and Jorgensen's magazine as a good alternative to that. And pending approval, Krag and Jorgensen plan to build further rifles to send to the commission. And I've included a quote from Krag to the Danish Shooting School from the 29th of August, 1884, on the right-hand side here, where he specifically credits Jorgensen for the redesign of his capsule magazine that he promoted to the Swedish-Norwegian Committee. And he also says, considering Jorgensen, I should patent, or I should get the rights a patent could provide, but I can also on his behalf state in advance that he will be satisfied with any arrangement deemed appropriate in Denmark if the design is successful. So now we've gotten to Erik Jørgensen. Like Krag, we're going to discuss his early life and whatnot. But Jorgensen's upbringing is very different when compared to Ole Krag. Where Krag was brought up in an affluent household and was given a lot of opportunities in life, Jorgensen grew up very poor on a farm and had very little formal education. Unfortunately, there's very few known documents that were penned by Erik Jørgensen. And a lot of the stuff we do know about him is because they're in letters addressed to Ole Krag from him. What we do know about him from newspaper reports is that he was a known introvert and he rarely appeared at public events and related to anything to the factory. Some people wrote that he was a very portly man who liked to sit in his office and smoke a briar's pipe. He was seen as a reserved individual, and there's one quote that said that he was characterized by his quiet demeanor, and despite not having a rich education, he displays high level of intelligence on par with any of his contemporaries. Thankfully, there's enough archived documentation from Ole Krag where he's writing about what Erik Jørgensen thinks that we can kind of piece together what his opinions on things were and what his life was like. So Erik Jørgensen was born on the 17th of April, or 17th of May, 1848 in Asker, Norway, and he was the son of Jorgen Olsen Solstad and Anne Margaret Olstadter. Jørgensen grew up on the Solstad farm, and he's one of 11 children. And his father was a blacksmith alongside his uncle Peter, who also worked on the farm and worked as a blacksmith. However, his uncle ended up going bankrupt in 1866 and had to return to blacksmithing full time. And then they eventually also had to sell their other farm, Falstad Farm, in 1871 due to financial issues that were involving debtors. So his father bought out Peter's portion of the farm and became in debt, and they had to work and up until his father passed away at the farm. So I'm sure Erik Jørgensen probably received a great working education on blacksmithing from his father and uncle. But he also went to school at local elementary schools. There was one called Vogelen School and Janslaka School, and they're actually both still around today. But his school report showed that he actually performed below average at the school. But he must have been impressive in some way because at the age of 17, he was granted a gunsmithing apprenticeship under Hans Larsen, which was something that a lot of people wanted. He actually had some sort of school in his own house where he took on multiple apprentices that were from like higher class educations and trained them. And Jorgensen seems to be like one of two people that were from a lower class family. So Jorgensen lived with the Larsen family at this place from 1865 to 1870, and he worked at Larsen's shop and produced rifles for him throughout those 5 years. So Jorgensen was actually making rifles for Yarman during the trials where Larsen and Krag were competing against each other. So it's possible that Jorgensen probably worked on the trials guns that Krag had competed against, and that's probably where the two first met. After completing his apprenticeship under Hans Larsen, Jorgensen was employed as a gunsmith at Kongsberg Waffenfabrik and worked directly under Ole Krag. Correspondence between Krag and Jorgensen shows that Jorgensen had carried out private gunsmithing at Krag's workshop on his farm around the same time he got hired at Kongsberg as well. And initially, this seems to be mostly tooling adjustments for producing arms or modifications for adjusting chamber tolerances in the early Krag rifles. And he also produced some small parts for later models of Krag Peterson rifle. In May 1871, Jorgensen applied for military service, specifically to the infantry, but he was dismissed due to medical reasons. And it's not exactly clear what the specific medical conditions were, but it seems it probably has something to do with him having a stroke. Jorgensen was often reported as being ill throughout most of his life, and he suffered from a lot of mini strokes throughout the years. He's also described as being, as I said before, a very portly man, and he worked late into the night and didn't get enough sleep. So it's possible that there was some sort of combination of all of these things that ended up causing him to have health issues. Although he was dismissed from active duty, he was able to join the military in some way as he passed a military gunsmithing exam in 1872 and became a military armorer. That same year, Jorgensen married Josephine Bergen on the 5th of October, 1872, and they would have three children. I also found some church records that said that he had a fourth son in 1873, but it seems that he died during childbirth and was buried at the Kongsberg graveyard. In 1875, Jorgensen was assigned to the 1st Akerhus Corps of the Smålands Battalion in Fredrikstad. And based on available information, it seems that he was still employed at the Kongsberg factory, but he wasn't actively working there since he was living in Fredrikstad. But he did continue to do private gunsmithing work for Ole Krag, and he received documentation and blueprints from Krag, and he would respond to them with changes. Jorgensen seems to have maintained some sort of balance of military and personal work when he worked in Fredrikstad. His main residence in Kongsberg was Zandsvermoen 221, which is actually only 2 houses down from where Krag's farm was. And this was a farm that was owned by Peter Anderson, who was a machinist at Kongsberg, who rented out a portion of it to Jorgensen's family. While in Fredrikstad, Jorgensen stayed at Toldbagaten 39, which is this yellow house you can see in the top left. This was rented out by a bar called Balklava. And around the block from his house was his gunsmithing shop, which was at Radhusgaten 23, which is this red building in the top here. Jorgensen's gunsmithing shop, it seems that he focused mainly on converting muzzleloaders to breech-loading arms, did some needle fire conversions to center or self-contained cartridge firing guns, but he did come up with some of his own firearms designs at this time. So in April 1875, Jorgensen patented this rifle that you see here. It's described by him as some sort of multi-shot hunting rifle. Unfortunately, none of these rifles are known to exist today, and the functionality of it from the patent isn't very clear. It seems from the drawing it has some sort of swinging loading gate that has a cartridge that lifts up into the chamber. The description of it in the patent isn't very clear either. He also later developed another design that was patented on the 30th of March, 1878. And the only information I can find on this patent is from the Norwegian Law Gazette from 1878 that describes it as the described locking mechanism for Lefaucheux rifles. I know that he had done some tinkering with Lefaucheux revolvers at Kongsberg, but I'm not really sure about anything to do with rifles. So if anyone has any information on Lefaucheux rifles, let me know. I'm sure that would help. And something else that comes up in documentation related to Jorgensen at this time are things called system Jorgensen rifles. So those are guns that he made that are entirely different from the 1875 and 1878 patents. And it seems that Ole Krag was a very early supporter of Jorgensen's gunsmithing ventures, and he often marketed the system Jorgensen rifles in letters to his friends. I've included a mention of one here that's Krag writing to a cousin of his wife's named Robert Collette, who had submitted a needle fire rifle to Kongsberg to get them to convert it to be a self-contained metallic cartridge firing gun. And Krag writes back and says, Gunsmith Jorgensen is currently employed at the weapons factory and has previously worked on a hunting rifle for a man in Fredrikstad. which is one of the most beautiful pieces I've seen, and in that regard, it surpasses the system you have shown me. The locking mechanism is in the handle, and when the hammer is cocked, the handle is twisted aside, and this opens the barrel. Extraction also occurs safely underneath the gun. The enclosed drawing shows a cartridge that will further explain the system. Do you mind if the parts you have sent to us at the factory um, are crafted at the weapons factory according to this new system? It allows for larger cartridges than one would otherwise have crafted according to the old design and will be somewhat cheaper. So the Norwegian Armed Forces Museum has one of these in their possession, marked System Jørgensen 1881 on the side. They have this listed as a pistol, but I actually think that this is the model of rifle that he had developed. This has a 22-inch barrel, so it's very long for a pistol. And you can see at the rear here, it has some sort of notch that I think is for some sort of stock attachment. And this gun is described in its functionality and by Krag exactly how the system Jørgensen operates. So I've got a video up here that shows you where Krag wrote, to open the mechanism, the hammer is put on half cock, after which the handle is twisted a quarter to the left, thereby exposing the barrel, and simultaneously the handle is pulled somewhat backward, extracting the cartridge from the chamber of the barrel. So despite the different attempts to develop his own firearms and sell them, it seems like there was not enough firearms work in Fredrikstad to keep Jørgensen's shop going, and he ended up returning to Kongsberg full-time and closing down his shop in 1882. Though when Erik returned to Kongsberg, he did so as the new chief armorer of the arms factory. So it was he and Krag who were essentially running the entire state arsenal in Kongsberg. Once receiving Krag's request to aid in the redesign of his capsule magazine, the two got to work making capsule magazine rifles for the Danish trials. And I've included one of the first redesigned magazines on the right-hand side here. You can see it's a lot more simplified and a lot sleeker. There's a switch on the right-hand side of the magazine that allows the spring tension to lower so that you can load cartridges a lot easier. And it's a somewhat successful design, but it still is far from being finalized. So now we've got both of them working on the capsule magazine, and the capsule magazine is really the birth of the Krag Jørgensen rifle, as you'll be able to see throughout this presentation. So from 1885 to 1886, Krag and Jørgensen submitted several redesigns of the capsule magazine. They were almost always paired with a Yarman rifle action. Jørgensen, who was present in Copenhagen for testing, would essentially relay all the feedback from the commission back to Krag in Norway, and the two would implement it on their designs. Krag wasn't able to attend most of the trials because he had too much responsibilities in Norway and wasn't able to get permission from military command to leave the country. There was too many iterations of these designs to really cover here, but I've included two examples. One at the top is a 10.15 millimeter 10-round capsule magazine, and the bottom one is a more refined 8mm version of that same system. You can see there's very minor changes on the magazine where, let's say, like the spring tension switch has been moved. Again, there's several different modifications to these designs that are way too much to cover here. But while testing these guns, the Danish Commission felt that the 10-round magazine would cause troops to waste ammunition, and they felt that the design was still too bulky, so they wanted Krag to redesign that. They also asked if he can make a version that was reduced to 5 rounds. So Krag developed a smaller 10-round magazine that you can see at the top here, but he also designed a 5-round magazine that he referred to as the half capsule magazine. There were several complaints during trials about the weight and bulkiness of the Yarman action as well. And this, combined with Yarman's demands for high royalties if the rifle was adopted using its action, caused the two to look elsewhere for some sort of rifle system. Krag had initially attempted to get permission from Ludwig Lowe to use the Mauser action, but this ended up going nowhere, and instead, Jørgensen ended up just designing an entirely new rifle action to replace the Yarman. It took features of the Yarman and Mauser and some other rifles and slimmed them down into a smaller package that was lightweight. And the new 10-round and 5-round magazines were paired with these new actions in 1886 and became the first Krag Jørgensen rifles. So the Model A is the one above with the 10-round magazine. The Model B is the 5-round magazine. And if anyone's familiar with the Danish Krag, you can see already this bottom magazine. It's essentially identical to what the final version would be. They kind of nail it right off the bat. So after several field trials and examination and experimentation, the Krag Jørgensen rifle would be adopted in Denmark in 1889. So again, there's dozens of unique trials models, but the two I've included here are probably the most important. The top rifle is serial number 16 of the trials rifles, and this gun is what Krag considered to be the prime example for further development. The bottom rifle is the Model B, and that gun was developed by the Danish arsenal to serve as the example for all future production. The adoption of the rifle in Denmark ended up getting Ole Krag and Erik Jørgensen $30,000, or sorry, 30,000 Danish kroner of royalties, and they were also knighted in the Danish Order of Dannebrog. So the royalties were split equally 50-50 between the two, but Krag did take a bit of Jorgensen's portion just to compensate himself for the travel and accommodations he had been paying for on behalf of Jorgensen. And after the adoption, they both realized that this gun could be adopted elsewhere, and they began to find investors to help development. And this led to both of them founding the Krag Jorgensen Rifle Company on the 13th of October, 1890. So by 1891, Erik Jorgensen had put his money to work, and he bought a large residence in Kongsberg called Birksrivergarden. That's located directly across from Kongsberg Church, and it's still there today, as you can see in this photo. It also includes a little plaque on the side of the building that tells you, amongst other things, that Erik Jorgensen used to own the house. The thing is that he actually didn't spend much time at home, it seems, because he was constantly traveling trying to market the Krag Jorgensen rifle, or he would be assigned to his battalion in Fredrikstad. From 1891 to 1892, he actually went to a handful of times to the U.S. for trials, and in 1893, he was also there helping Springfield set up tooling to produce the gun in that country. Um, and in the same year, Ole Krag invested a lot of his profits to real estate, as well as the Krag Jorgensen Rifle Company. But soon after the adoption, he was assigned to the Norwegian Swedish Arms Commission, and they were gearing up to adopt their own magazine-fed rifle as well. Uh, Originally, the commission would just conduct experiments with 6.5 millimeter cartridges, which Krag was involved in developing as well. But once the Krag Jorgensen rifle ended up getting past the initial stages of examination, he had to recuse himself from testing to not influence the final adoption. But outside of his army experiments, he also had been developing some modifications for sporting rifles. So one of the more significant ones was probably this modification he made for the rolling block, which you can see here. The modification consists of a replacement for the trigger guard that replaces it with a lever, and this lever simultaneously cocks the gun, opens the breech, um, and allows you to extract a cartridge all in one swoop rather than multiple stages. He also later on developed a version of this with Hans Larsen called the Krag's Larsen Remington rifle, which seems to have been essentially the same design, just with some additional features that Larsen had patented. And there's some mentions of these in newspapers by the Shooting Association, so it seems that it had caught on a little bit. I should say that Krag and Jorgensen were probably some of the most involved gunsmiths that I know of that were in the sport shooting community. They both attended competitions constantly. Jorgensen was there at almost all meetings at Kongsberg and Fredrikstad shooting associations. He fired around 700 practice shots a year that were recorded at these clubs. Krag helped establish the Eidsvoll Rifle Association, and he also founded the Kongsberg Rifle Association as well. And because of their involvement in the shooting associations and their involvement in Norwegian arms design, they were both appointed Knights of the Order of St. Olav. Krag was appointed in 1890 and Jorgensen was appointed in 1894. So we now know in the US, Norway, and Denmark, they all adopted the Krag rifle. But what happened in the countries that didn't? There's a lot of different countries that did test them. There's not too many that are significant enough to mention, but the one that I find is pretty significant is Turkey. So in the spring of 1893, Sultan Abdulhamid II had written to Krag inviting him to Constantinople to discuss the rifle's adoption. So Krag initially had sent a carbine to them for testing, but after he received this letter, he brought several rifles to Turkey personally and demonstrated them to Ottoman officials. They suggested that they'd adopt the rifles if chambered for their 7 millimeter cartridge, and stated that the Sultan wanted to place an order for 500,000 rifles as soon as possible. Now, this sounds great at first, but the issue is that Krag didn't have the facilities to produce the rifles. One of the struggles that he had been dealing with at the time was still updating Kongsberg's manufacturing capabilities. And even after they adopted the Krag Jorgensen rifles for themselves, they couldn't handle producing around 30,000 for their own troops, let alone 500,000 for another country. So the Ottomans actually contracted Krag to go to Steyr on their behalf and negotiate for the production of 500,000 rifles. And although Steyr in Austria was willing to produce some for Norway a couple years later, they were definitely not in favor of producing them for the Ottomans. So Krag had to inform the Sultan that this wasn't going to be possible. To Krag's surprise, the Sultan actually hired Krag to draft plans in order to build an arms factory in Constantinople to build Krag Jorgensen rifles. The Sultan also offered Krag the position of head of the gunmaking factory and commander of the Ottoman artillery, which he declined. But nevertheless, Krag spent several months in Turkey working on factory plans to actually make this factory for the Sultan. And he corresponded with Jørgensen about production details, and they purchased tooling for the Ottoman factory. They did quite a bit. According to reports from the Krag Jørgensen Rifle Company, the gun was essentially considered adopted at this time by the Ottomans, at least by summer 1893. However, once Krag actually formally began construction at the armory, he was informed that the Ottomans had bought 200,000 1893 Mauser rifles, and the project was canceled. So, in recognition for his efforts, Krag and Jørgensen were both inducted into the Turkish Order of Osmania in 1894, and they were given some accommodations, but like they weren't given any compensation for their wasted time with the Ottomans. So Krag was understandably annoyed. I've included some photos here of the envelope that Jørgensen received that contained his medal and induction letter into the order. On the right-hand side, you'll see a collection of Ole Krag's medals that's at the Norwegian Mining Museum. The top row, the top three medals on that are the ones that he received from Turkey. There's a few more notable tests that I could talk about, like Mexico wanted a couple. Cuba actually made an order of 8,000 that was never fulfilled. But one of the most interesting ones to me is the South African Boers actually purchased a couple hundred Steyr-made reject rifles from the Norwegian Krag Jørgensen Rifle Company and used them during the Boer War. And you can see some photos here of Boer General Tobias Smuts with one of those rifles on the right-hand side. But by 1894, Krag was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and the following year he ended up retiring as the director of Kongsberg Waffenfabrik. He still ended up working with the arsenal to negotiate contracts with companies like FN to produce rifles on Norway's behalf. Erik Jørgensen was still employed at the factory, and by 1895 he was sent to Liège, Belgium to assist FN with this. However, due to FN defaulting on the contract, Jørgensen was then redirected to Steyr and worked with them throughout November 1895 for the same purpose. He also helped them again from February to April 1896, and Krag joined him halfway through that to help him develop the tooling to make the guns for Norway. So as you can probably tell, these guys are bouncing back and forth like crazy to different countries in order to try to market their firearm. And it's already probably a daunting task for someone like Krag, who is approaching his 60s while doing this. But Jørgensen was very ill throughout his entire life, and it must have taken a toll on his health. By 1896, in April, following army exercises with his battalion in Fredrikstad, Jørgensen suffered a large stroke and was discharged from service due to chronic illness. His son was also discharged around the same month, and his reason is listed as notable physical defect, but the defect isn't elaborated on. From asking around, what I can what I see is that this was a common thing to discharge young men who had family members that needed full-time care so that they could stay home and take care of them, and this might have been the case here. But while at home, Erik was apparently recovering slowly, and he needed a cane to walk, but he was able to walk, but then he would have another stroke and relapse, and they would just start the recovery again. Krag continued to run the rifle factory alongside his board while he recovered, but any development of the Krag Jørgensen system basically ended at this time. So on the 15th of September at 6 a.m., Jørgensen's wife woke up and noticed that the oil lamp in Jørgensen's drafting room was still on, but he wasn't there. She believed that he probably went for a morning walk around the river Numedalslagen near his home in Kongsberg. And I've included a video that shows the path from his house to the river, just so you guys have a bit of context. This walk was supposedly something that Jørgensen and his wife had been prone to do prior to having his stroke. And on the night of the 14th, they had written that he had been in good spirits and was doing well with his recovery, and that he was starting to walk by himself without a cane. However, his family believed that he wasn't in any condition to go on a walk alone, so they went out looking for him. And around 7:30 in the morning, Jørgensen's son, Erik Christian Jørgensen, found his body close to the shore. And it seems that he was found upstream of the rapids near the new bridge, Nybrua, across the river. In this spot here, you can see in the water, this is where they found his body. News reports state that Erik's body was half on the shoreline, and he was only submerged about 2 meters of water, and he was gripping a guard pole when he drowned. Based on the opinion of the Dr. Hartmann who appeared there, it seems like Jørgensen suffered a stroke and fell in the water and struggled trying to pull himself out and drowned. Josephine Jørgensen, Erik Jørgensen's wife, she wrote a small note in the newspaper in Kongsberg Blad on the 18th of September 1896, where she invited people to come to his funeral, which would take place at their home the next day at 1 p.m. The funeral wreaths were placed on his coffin by Ole Krag and some other people from Kongsberg Waffenfabrik, like Lieutenant Gilsrud, who was a control officer who worked alongside him. There were several non-commissioned officers from his battalion as well that visited. There were army factory marshals and gunsmiths who wore gunsmiths uniforms and carried his casket to his grave dressed in them. Family and friends spoke about him at the Kongsberg Church. Ole Krag apparently had a very lengthy speech about Jorgensen's work and their friendship. Provost John Christian Bergen, who was Josephine's brother, spoke about him in very kind words and ended the ceremony by saying, "May Norway nurture many such sons." Just for your reference here, I've included a photo of his gravestone at Kongsberg Church. It's very easy to find. It's actually the tallest gravestone in the church graveyard if you go there. I've also included an overhead map of where his house was, where the church is, where that bridge is that I referenced, and where he died. And they're all within around 200 meters of each other. It's actually like you can hit all spots at once if you end up visiting there. So Jorgensen's death deeply affected Krag. He essentially ended development of the rifle system altogether outside of like for respect of Jorgensen. He didn't quite have the heart to continue developing it. However, as soon as Jorgensen died, newspapers started publishing reports saying that Krag had taken advantage of Jorgensen and had accused him of stealing credit for the design and mistreating him. Some reports were even saying that he is the true inventor of the rifle system, that Krag didn't do anything on it. And some, like this one that I've included here, actually were pretty egregious, where they said that Krag had driven Jorgensen to suicide. This quote's pretty long, but I'll read it anyway because it kind of emphasizes what people were saying about Krag even 2 years after this occurred. They say, "There are not many today who believe that gunsmith Jorgensen's death was merely an accident. As the water level in the small river where he's found was only a couple of feet high, what could have been the cause? We shall answer this with logical assertions, and moreover, that besides us, there are people whom Mr. Jorgensen expressed himself to in much the same way when he was alive, and said his idea was stolen. For many years, the deceased gunsmith of Kongsberg Arms Factory, Mr. Jorgensen, had contemplated producing the arm that would surpass the others in strength, speed, and range. After years of effort, he succeeded. But what could the unfamiliar, impoverished craftsman do alone? No influential friends, no money, and only possessing a geographical knowledge of the world that did not extend much past Norway, and moreover, a subordinate worker at Norwegian government institution. What could have been more natural than for the modest subordinate worker to confide in his high-ranking boss and allow him to share in the invention, thereby enabling him to further develop it and make it profitable? The rifle invention had already been made when Director Krag was already an elderly man, over 50, in addition feeble-minded. So the mental abilities of such a man cannot be considered particularly great. And thus Jorgensen's invention was set out into the world under the name Krag Jorgensen rifle. A company to market the weapon was formed in Christiania. Speeches and banquets were held in honor of the new firearm, but the one who was not present and did not represent the invention was the silent, introverted gunsmith. While his partner in the invention received all the praise and accolades for his technical genius, the actual inventor continued to repair government's old, worn-out firearms at Kongsberg. He had to in order to survive. So, newspapers like this obviously are going to be impacting Krag's reputation, especially in Kongsberg. And he had been combating them for years, and so had other newspapers who had claimed that the attacks on him had to do with political reasons. And Krag also got involved with a lot of lawsuits from other people who also claimed that they invented the Krag Jorgensen rifle. And he essentially won all of these lawsuits, but it's still not something you want to deal with as an arms designer. Krag, because of this, ended up publishing a couple small papers outlining his arms history in October 1898 to prove that he had not stolen the design from Jorgensen. And in this, he reiterates that they're both 50-50 responsible for the design. Krag mostly did the magazine. Erik Jørgensen mostly did the rifle action. But then, like, the barrel was Krag's design, or the barrel bands were Jørgensen's design. He like broke it down like this, and he sent that out around Kongsberg specifically. But you don't even really need that to understand that this is nonsense. And for an additional proof that it's kind of nonsense, I've included this photo here. So this photo is of Erik Jørgensen's son, Erik Christian Jørgensen, who had become a photographer later in life. And he pictured himself looking at some proofs from the Kongsberg Church that he had taken a photo album or been making a photo album of. And on his wall, underneath a photo of his father, you can see a photo of Ole Krag. And you'd think that if you think someone had stolen your father's life work and it took him credit for the firearms design, you wouldn't hang a picture of him on your wall late in life. So, Erik Jørgensen has now passed away. So what does Krag do after the Krag Jørgensen? He actually does a lot for someone you'd think is getting close to retirement age. And they all usually have to do with magazines. So In 1900 and 1901, Krag patented a conversion for the British Lee Enfield magazine and essentially turned the box magazine of the British Lee Enfield into a Krag half capsule magazine with a door on the side so you can load the magazine without taking the magazine out of the gun and or opening the breech. He also submitted a 303 British version of the Krag Jørgensen rifle to British authorities, but it was tested, not adopted. I've never actually seen a version of that, so if anyone out there knows where that is, I've checked with the collection in Leeds, they don't have it. Um, but also haven't seen any version with this magazine. But when I was at the Ole Krag Private Archive in Oslo, I found this picture that Ole Krag had taken in 1901 that shows how the magazine system works. Seems they cut out the side of the long Lee Enfield here in order to have the door for the magazine. But it seems that it essentially functioned identically to what the Krag Jorgensen magazine functions like. In 1902, he also was forced to retire from active military service due to reaching the age of 65, which was the limit for an active military officer. But despite his forced retirement, he still went to the arms factory. He was still involved in Norwegian politics, was still involved with the military, and he, of course, continued his experiments. So one of the experiments here is a magazine adaptation for the French Gevær rifle. So Krag's idea for developing these magazines was essentially that all these countries now have these outdated single-shot rifles in the hundreds of thousands that are just sitting around, and you can make them viable second-line firearms if you just created a cheap magazine that would be able to attach to the side of it. So he had patented this design and he had gone to develop it and produce it, but Kongsberg, since he retired, no longer allowed him to use the tooling at the factory to produce his own guns. So he ended up actually asking a Captain Rasmussen in Denmark, who worked at the Danish arsenal at Copenhagen, to produce 10 modified Krag rifles on his behalf, which he did so for a fee, and then they submitted it to testing in Paris in late 1903. So Krag seems to have been quite confident in this Krag design. There's only 10 of them that exist. This one's at the Institute of Military Technology in Florida. And during testing, French officials, I haven't found the actual report, but I found letters from French officials who tested it, who said that they believed the design functioned well, but it was ultimately deemed too costly for any large production, so the only ones that were produced were these initial 10. So you can see Krag is still actively working on firearms designs, but you noticed he's almost entirely abandoned the Krag Jørgensen still. His lack of motivation for it actually would soon come to bite him because the Krag Jørgensen Rifle Company was exclusively relying on, number one, the development of the gun for future adoption, and number two, the U.S. royalties from the adoption of the Krag Jørgensen rifle. So America had produced over 450,000 of the rifles, and at $1 per rifle royalties, they were making a lot of money. But after the adoption of the 1903 Springfield, funds stopped entirely and the company needed a new source of income. So Captain Rasmussen at some point had mentioned to Krag that they were developing a new carbine model of their rifle. So Krag used this opportunity to send them a new carbine model for testing. It really seems that this was influenced by the company pushing him to get more financial backing. And this carbine was essentially a Danish Krag action with a Norwegian style of stock and barrel bands and whatnot. The Danish testers did say the gun was actually cheaper and better to handle than the other gun, but instead of adopting it, they ended up pursuing domestic manufacturing of automatic rifles like the Geværs, like the Madsen experimental rifles, which ended up going nowhere anyway. But with no more profits coming in, the Krag Jørgensen Rifle Company was dissolved on the 23rd of August, 1904, and Krag bought all the patents back in 1905. So after that, he's been failing with magazines and rifles, so he goes to the new hot fad, which is self-contained, self-loading cartridges. And some of the early designs you can see in his design drawings and his design journals that are at the Norwegian Armed Forces Museum. Again, way too many to show, but I've shown some of the earliest ones he's got here. It seems that he started as early as April 1904. That's the one on the right-hand side here. There's dozens of designs, but eventually he ended up simplifying his design into a pistol conversion that was able to be adapted to most pistol designs that existed at the time and allowed them to be manipulated with one hand for cavalry use. So I've got an example here of a conversion done in 1905 to the FN model 1903. Essentially, this conversion replaces the trigger guard with a cocking bar that's attached to the slide to allow the gun to be cocked with one hand. It also includes a see-through round counter on the grip and a cocking indicator on the slide. And this was all so that cavalrymen would have an easier time operating pistols while on horseback. He demonstrated this gun to Norwegian officials, And even though they didn't adopt it, they encouraged him to continue developing the system. He also ended up displaying this to Swedish military officials in 1907, who actually considered adopting it for the cavalry. However, they wanted to do that on domestically produced guns, and at the time they were still buying guns from FN, and they didn't actually end up doing domestic production until 1917. So the production of this never occurred. The currently issued Model 1907 pistols that were shipped from FN in Belgium to Sweden, they considered the conversion to be too much of an extra cost. But they still considered his design successful, and they told him that he should produce his own pistol designs for testing. So, because of the encouragement, he ended up producing his own pistol designs starting in 1907. I've showed one of the earliest pistols that Krag produced here. It's extremely, extremely crude, but it still gets across that he's actually making physical examples of his own pistols at this time. And he actually had a lot of interest in his pistols. For example, in 1908, there was an agent from the Norwegian manufacturing company O. Mustad and Son who wrote to Krag and suggested that their factory in Australia could produce these guns for him. In August 1909, Alfred Gaden Esmer in Denmark asked if the pistols were ready for manufacture and if they could provide them through their store in Copenhagen. Waffenfabrik Bergman actually contacted Krag in 1910 and asked if he'd be willing to produce his pistols through them once it was considered ready. And I find that very interesting because Bergman later produced the Einhand design, which was virtually the same concept as Krag's, but was developed and patented by a Polish engineer named Witold Czeluski. This design here is nothing like the Einhand design, but you'll see later production ones like these. You can kind of see where that's starting to come from. So in 1909, tests with several pistols were conducted with firing tests that were made at human cadavers to test the effects of cartridges and projectile types. So Krag actually used this testing to submit different versions of his pistol. He submitted versions that were in 455 Webley, 32 ACP, 25 ACP, 9mm Browning, a bunch of different types of versions. I've included some of them on the left-hand side here. And they received pretty positive reviews despite them being quite crude toolroom examples. In 1910, the Norwegian trials were conducted with pistols designed by Krag, Colt, Bayard, Fiedeland, Hansen, Sungard, a bunch of other people, some other smaller submissions that weren't really thoroughly tested, but were submitted. And although Colt's Model 1910 pistol was favored, negotiations for its production in Norway caused long delays in its adoption. And as a result, testing continued, and Krag continued to develop guns to submit during this time. So you'll see on the right-hand side is one of those Model 1910 versions, and you can see how refined his design's getting over time. This actually looks more or less like a production example rather than a toolroom example. And then throughout 1910, he also produced other versions of his pistols. So you can see in this example here, he's got little pocket pistols that are in 25 ACP or 32 ACP. And of course, if you're going to produce a self-loading pistol, you have to do a stocked version. So he's got this stocked version here with an extended barrel and forend. Ultimately, none of these were adopted. He also got them tested in 1912. And he also converted a Colt Model 1910 to use his one-handed system, which they liked, but they thought the cost of conversion was too high, so they adopted a regular version of this pistol. So Krag's pistols are ultimately not adopted, but he continued to market them to other countries and also to commercial manufacturers. So Krag's biggest issue was that he had nowhere to produce these pistols anyway, even if they were adopted, which is why he was hoping for a military contract, because they would handle production themselves. So he spent a significant amount of time traveling, specifically in the U.S., to find arms manufacturers that would be willing to produce his designs. There's a lot of different companies like Iver Johnson, Remington, UMC, Colt, and whatnot that are discussing manufacturing his pistols, but none of them ultimately struck any deals with him. There were companies like Harrington and Richardson who were really, really interested in producing his pistol. They actually set up a meeting with H&R representatives and Webley and Scott representatives in London because they wanted to introduce his conversion on the Webley and Scott automatic pistol in their next catalog. After a few meetings with the company representatives, it was suggested they would produce them, but it seems that none were made. I'm not exactly sure what happened there. Krag and Savage had also been corresponding several times throughout summer 1911, and they said they wanted to introduce his option as a conversion for the Savage Model 1907 in their next catalog as well. But again, none were produced, and the only examples we have of them are these design drawings from Ole Krag's design journal. It's unclear if any actual physical models were made, but there is one letter to the Savage Company where they say they had a thorough examination, and I'm not sure if they're talking about design drawings or a physical model that Krag had sent them. of all places, Krag would eventually find interest in his pistols from Russia. So Krag had sent some test pistols in the summer of 1911 with officers to Russia, and he received news in 1912 that they actually successfully passed trials there. So the Okhrana, who are the Imperial Secret Police, and the St. Petersburg Police, they actually formally adopted the Krag pistol, and General Kamenev placed an order of 1,200 pistols chambered for 32 ACP, and they had said that they wanted more orders for the police and army to come after, but the payment to fulfill the order depended on if Krag could provide the facilities to produce the pistols. So this is something that Krag had been constantly struggling with, and this is what he would continue to struggle with. Krag contacted Kongsberg again, and he was able to negotiate some sort of deal in October 1912, but it was still too expensive. They said they couldn't help him for anything less than 50 kroner per pistol, and at 4 to 5 months for a production timeline, which was seen as too cost prohibitive for Krag. Husqvarna in Sweden quoted him for 1,250 pistols, but they said for a cheap cost and a fast production rate, they were too busy with army production to dedicate anything towards him. There's a Danish machining factory named Nielsen and Withers who was interested, but they found that the specialized tooling was too expensive. FN in Belgium stated the costs associated with it were also too expensive for a small production, and they said they could cheapen it if they produced more, but the Russians didn't want to order more yet. Krag just couldn't find anyone willing to actually produce his pistols, and lacking the production and facility, Krag's Russia order fell through, and it led to the dissolution of the Krag Automatic Pistol Company in 1914. And he ended up having to reimburse the stockholders in that company 15,000 kroner once the company shut down. So Krag didn't let these failures stop him, and even in his old age, he continued to try to market the pistols independently. When sailing to France from the UK in late 1916 to display his pistols to the French army, he ended up contracting pneumonia on the board of the ship and was quite sick upon his arrival to Paris. To others, Krag seemed like he was just recovering from an old cold, but he got progressively worse after an incident at Minister Herman Wilde Jarlsberg residence in Paris, where he collapsed. And due to his pneumonia, he eventually passed away on the 9th of December 1916 at the age of 79, 3 weeks after his arrival to Paris. A memorial service was quickly held at the Swedish church in Paris before arrangements were made to bring Krag's body back to Norway. And on the 27th of January 1917, his wife Kaya announced the date and time for his funeral. A lot of people attended his funeral. The king of Sweden, Håkon VII, attended, and he attended a eulogy for Krag hosted by the Norwegian National Economic Group, praised Krag as a friend of the technical sciences and the crown. Ridderganda Street behind Kongsberg Arms Factory was actually renamed Kragsgate in his honor and is still called Kragsgate today. Despite the failures Krag had seen in his life, it's still a fact that he and Jørgensen produced a rifle that had a great impact of arms technology. And by the mid 1950s, globally had seen a production of roughly 865,000 rifles and carbines. So, despite Jørgensen only living to the age of 48 and coming from relatively low means, he still had a big impact, and so did Krag. And that's it, you guys.
Well,